Welcome to today's webinar, Introducing AASHTO's newest practitioner handbook on implementing ecological. We look forward to your participation today. I'm Katie Kurgan, and I'm the Associate Program Manager for SHARP 2 implementation at AASHTO, and I'll be serving as your host and moderator for today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items and help you participate in today's event. Just as a reminder, all attendees are in listen-only mode, meaning that your phones have automatically been muted. You will be able to submit questions at any time during today's webinar, although we will hold them until the end of the webinar during our Q&A session. You can ask your questions simply by typing them into the chat window of your control panel, which is the rectangular panel on the right-hand section of your viewing screen. After the webinar, a PDF file of these slides that you're seeing now, as well as an on-demand video of this presentation, will be posted on the Center for Environmental Excellence by AASHTO's website. You also can download the PDF file of the Practitioner's Handbook there today. Before we jump into the meat of today's webinar, I'd like to take a moment to share a few poll questions that you'll begin to see on your screen. We'd appreciate if you could respond to these questions. So I'm just going to start loading the first one now, which is asking, how many people are participating with you today in the webinar? Great, thank you so much. So we have just two more. And our next one is, does your agency utilize AASHTO's Practitioner's Handbook series? Great, thank you for your input. And we just have one last one. What is your affiliation? Thank you so much for participating in our polls. Today's webinar is being brought to you through the Second Strategic Highway Research Program, which is a cooperative agreement between AASHTO and the Federal Highways to implement this ecological project. This collaboration has produced a number of workshops, peer exchanges, online information, including this Practitioner's Handbook, all about ecological. I am the product lead for this product, and my counterpart at Federal Highways is Dave Williams. Dave's listening in today and will be available for any questions during our Q&A session. The objective of the SHARP 2 program is to provide technical information in a usable format for implementation. You can view other SHARP 2 products information on either the AASHTO or the Federal Highways websites, which you can see on this slide. Now for just a little bit more information about the SHARP 2 program if you're not already familiar with it. As you can see here, the SHARP 2 program is divided into 4 focus areas: safety, renewal, capacity, and reliability. The ecological project is under the capacity focus area. You can see a little bit more information about that area on your slide. We have some resounding statistics that I'd like to share with you about this program, which is really designed to help state DOTs, MPOs, and other transportation agencies and regulatory agencies take the state of the practice to the next step. We've had 7 rounds of implementation assistance in which ecological was in round 1. It was first out of the gates. But in that program, we've received over 500 applications and have had 430 projects from all the states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. and they're implementing 63 solutions. We've already implemented $130 million worth of projects. It's really quite astounding. I did want to take a moment to mention that this practitioner's handbook is one of a series from the Center for Environmental Excellence. And you can see here on the list that it's number 16, as well as the web address of where you can find it. You can also find resource materials and other documents on this website. The development of this practitioner's handbook would not have been possible without participation from a number of staff from state DOTs, MPOs, FHWA, and other individuals. These people dedicated a lot of time to provide thoughtful comments on our draft documents prior to its publication. I've listed their names here and want to convey how much AASHTO appreciates their efforts and simply say thank you. I'd also like to extend a huge thank you to the Standing Committee on Environment members who participated in the balloting process. For those of you that don't know, by AASHTO's bylaws, we need to receive a 3/4 majority vote to publish any new practitioner's handbook. So this too was also made available possible by the Standing Committee on Environment. Now I'd like to begin by providing you some background in the preparation of the practitioner's handbook. And I'd also like to go over the webinar agenda. Next up, I'll provide some background information on ecological. Then I'll provide an overview of the practitioner's handbook format and highlight some key content. Then we'll have 3 presentations highlighting ecological projects examples that represent different steps in the ecological approach. We will have presentations by Margaret Barandas of Michigan DOT, Craig Casper from the Pikes Peak Area COG, and Judy Gates from Maine DOT. And as a reminder, we'll wrap up with a Q&A session. So if you have any questions during any of our presentations, please feel free to enter them into the question box and we'll address them towards the end of our program. Each practitioner's handbook is based on a specific subject matter. The content of our newest handbook, number 16, is implementing ecological based on the ecological approach. Ecological was developed by the Federal Highway Administration and 7 federal agency partners, and you can see their logos listed here on this PowerPoint slide. It provides a landscape approach that brings together transportation, resources, and regulatory agencies to integrate their plans and arrive at joint sets of environmental priorities across an ecosystem. This approach reduces risks for projects by establishing mitigation strategies and reliability in their schedules that lead to more timely permit decisions. The ecological approach is explained in a series of 9 steps and is shown on this slide. These steps organize a series of activities to establish partnerships, characterize resources while assessing transportation projects, and then developing agreements to accomplish these program goals. The practitioner's handbook describes each of these steps in more detail, and we'll hear from our presenters on how they've been working to specifically implement these steps. You can see here a screenshot of our newest practitioner's handbook, which was just published last month. The content of this document is organized by the sections listed here, including an overview, background briefing, key issues to consider, practical tips, and reference materials. This outline follows the format of the Practitioner's Handbook series, so the organization should be familiar to you. And the next slide, I'm just going to highlight a few key issues in which you'll see in each of these sections. The overview and background briefing sections of the Practitioner's Handbooks provide you with the content of the ecological approach. The overview section provides a summary of the goals and benefits of this approach. Then the background briefing section identifies and describes federal initiatives such as executive orders, regulations, or guidance that support or relate to ecological approach. This content is current to the release of the FAST Act. In addition, it also relates ecological to other FHW programs, including planning and environmental linkages. At the end of this section is a table summarizing the steps of the ecological approach. Next, we have the Key Issues to Consider section, where you find practical information and topics that you should consider as you implement the ecological approach. These topics range from how you can consider the scale of your planning area, engaging your stakeholders, and staffing commitments. The Practical Tips section is where you'll find the content that provides a summary of each of the steps of ecological. It starts off with a bulleted list of goals for each step, and then there is a brief narrative describing the activities of these steps. The final section of the document includes a brief conclusion discussion. Also, the web links for the online references are included and can also be found on the Center for Environmental Excellence's webpage. Another resource for your consideration when determining your best approach for ecological is the FHWA Ecological website. The homepage is shown here. Here you will find summaries of each ecological step, as well as links to key support documents, as well as examples of other ecological programs in a broad range of state DOTs and MPOs. Now I'd like to start off our 3 presentations, starting off with Margaret Barondess from Michigan DOT.
Hi, everybody. This is Margaret Barondess from the Michigan Department of Transportation. I'm very happy to be here with you today to talk about our I-75 Corridor Conservation Plan. There we go. How do you get started with the ecological approach? To get started, it's important to consider reviewing the available tools you have to manage the approach for your agency. And fortunately, through the SHARP 2 efforts, we have a lot more resources than we had a couple of years ago. So this is kind of a bonus. A review of the Practitioner's Handbook is a great way to start. This is the brand new handbook. For us at Michigan, we started with step number 1 to strengthen our relationships with our partnering agencies. We combined our coordination with our stakeholders to establish our data for the project. These 2 steps will be the focus of my presentation today. And just to touch back to the Practitioner's Handbook, both steps 1 and 2 are summarized in the Practical Tips section of the handbook. In the goals and summaries of these steps, you'll find helpful advice about how to consider a geographic area for your program, which actually can be a little more challenging than you might think, establishing team responsibilities, and how to consider decisions about documentation when working to build and strengthen collaborative partnerships. And I would like to emphasize the documentation component. From our experience, we went very fast and we covered a lot of territory, and it was important for us to document as we went along so we could recapture that information at the end and understand what our journey had been like. As you work with establishing your data set, you can read about suggestions for mapping tools and how to consider the resources to include in your framework. And for another resource, as a reminder, you can review the summary of step 1 on the FHWA Ecological webpage. Just below the logo on the right-hand side is a list of links. These are other resources or examples from other ecological programs. Now I'm going to talk about our study in Michigan. Located in the southernmost county on the southeastmost county of Michigan, Monroe County. In the early 1950s, the State Highway Department started building a freeway from Detroit to Toledo to connect these 2 major metropolitan areas. The department was fresh off the success of building a number of freeway facilities to support Detroit's factories during World War II. So the highway engineers believed they could conquer anything. They built the freeway on a straight line between the 2 cities. However, they built it through the former Maumee Lake Plain, a flat, poorly drained, former wetland area that had been drained for farming. One of the challenges we have out in this study location today includes an abundance of exotic plant species Particularly, we have the Phragmites grasses, the very large grasses that love to grow on the roadside. So that is sort of a consequence of being out in this wet, flat, poorly drained area. There are other consequences to being in this location. Because of the wet conditions, the freeway has deteriorated and needs complete reconstruction with entirely new drainage. I-75 is our busiest truck corridor. It carries the most traffic between Michigan and provides a clean link to Canada. I would say in Michigan, between Canada and Ohio and the rest of the United States. Because the drainage system will be reconstructed, the worst case scenario for impacts includes excavation from right-of-way fence line on the east to right-of-way fence line on the west. So basically everything within the right-of-way is subject to ground disturbance. Within the corridor, we have natural resources such as wetlands that have reestablished themselves on the grassy road right-of-way. Roadside mowing has also encouraged the growth of native lake plain prairie plant species, of which I will speak further in a minute. The total project will take 20 years to complete, about $500 million, and there will be 5 phases of construction. To start, we had 3 primary partners in a core team: MDOT,
really not intuitive.
the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments,
and click on select account codes.
or SEMCOG. Sounds like somebody
so
needs to go on mute.
Put in the project number, the task number, the expenditure type. What is
Hello. Okay, I'll keep going.
I always
The
use the one. It's an information
Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, or SEMCOG, and the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, our conservation planning partner.
And then you can just put V322.
The partners organized a technical advisory committee,
like a whole book of all the different expenditure types. There's like
or a
hundreds,
TAC,
but I don't think anyone really pays attention to that.
Met 11 times during the study. The TAC included our state and federal regulatory agency partners, the Nature Conservancy, and the Monroe County Planning Office. Getting and keeping these folks engaged was a focus of the core team. We held face-to-face meetings with conference call-in, produced meeting notes, and spent individual phone time with the members of the TAC. One of the keys to keeping folks engaged was that everyone could benefit from the study, not just the highway agency. We also had a topic of focus for the agencies in that Lake Erie has received a lot of attention in recent years due to its declining health. Let's try again here to flip the slide. There we go. Our mission statement for our study was to develop and implement a collaboratively based landscape scale conservation plan that also facilitates rebuilding the I-75 corridor while maximizing conservation and restoration outcomes in the region. Rather than being lone wolves out there in the landscape, we wanted to be part of all the other conservation efforts taking place in the western Lake Erie Basin. What were some of the benefits that came from building the partnerships with the TAC and with the local community? One of them was that the partnerships gave access to data we didn't know about and helped us bust through barriers to gain access to other data. MDOT realized cost savings in its data acquisition through these partnerships. While not quantifiably necessarily, MDOT has realized improved resource agency interactions. When the agencies face planning challenges along with you, they gain a better understanding of the realities of implementing environmental mitigation. Likewise, the public came to see us as a partner rather than an interloper. Our mitigation choices improved dramatically with partnering, as we'll talk about in the next slide. Permitting has become more streamlined. For example, our Department of Environmental Quality applied flexibility in approving the permit request for minor wetland impacts on the first construction segment because they participated in the ecological process and could see MDOT's commitment to partnership in finding the best wetland mitigation site possible. There we go, outcome of partnering. Another benefit was finding better wetland mitigation. In coastal areas, finding a suitable wetland mitigation site can be very challenging. At MDOT, we have 8 wetland bank sites, but all of them are located inland away from the coast, primarily because of lower land costs, ready availability, and willing sellers. Due to the SHARP 2 partnering, MDOT learned that the MDNR, our Michigan Department of Natural Resources, was purchasing farmland to the east of I-75 to add to Erie State Game Area. The MDNR had planned to restore the farmland to coastal wetland, but did not have the funding to perform the restoration. MDOT was able to supply $900,000 in funds to the MDNR for the wetland restoration, and we gained the benefit of having the MDNR tend to the long-term management of the sites. Another positive outcome of our partnering on the SHARP 2 project was our public outreach initiative. I-75 is a gateway into Michigan, so MDOT maintains a welcome center, visited about 1 million people a year. The Michigan Natural Features Inventory successfully obtained a $75,000 grant from the NOAA BWET program for 2017. This is just recent that we heard about this, to develop a place-based classroom and field investigation program for teachers and their middle and high school students that will help them to better understand their local wetland ecosystems, how transportation networks may impact these watersheds, and stewardship activities they can engage in to help address the impacts of the transportation network. The program will also develop exhibit materials to be placed in MDOT's Monroe Welcome Center. A major emphasis of the exhibits will be invasive species control. The grant was inspired by the I-75 conservation planning process. MDOT benefits through the development of content for its Welcome Center. Another positive outcome of our partnering, again, better mitigation. Because the highway right-of-way is kind of an island of Lake Plain Prairie in a sea of agricultural and urban land use, rare native plants thrive there. I mentioned earlier that the mowing practice tends to help those plants with their reproductive cycles as well. A plant survey identified 16,000 individual state-threatened plants that will need a state permit for relocation prior to construction. This is our largest plant mitigation initiative ever. The MDNR, Michigan Department of Natural Resources, has stepped forward to take most of these plants, these transplants, into a prairie restoration area located in Sterling State Park, very close to I-75 and right on Lake Erie. This partnership will help MDOT obtain our needed state permits for the plant relocations, and since the local genotypes for these plants will find a local home. We're not carrying them halfway across the state. What were the key factors of our success in partnering as part of the ecological process? First, having the core team include a DOT, an MPO, and a conservation planner provided the right mix of planning and project implementation expertise. Extensive outreach included 2 public meetings and about a dozen local expert meetings. This proved very important to incorporating the local perspective into the plan. Finding a larger sense of purpose beyond the freeway project made the plan more relevant to the participants. Lastly, support from MDOT leadership and the project development engineers contributed to our success. Because of the ecological project and our SHARP 2 grant, our engineers understood the context and significance of our requests for mitigation funding. Our environmental staff experienced less pushback on their funding requests. Oh, I jumped ahead to the wrong slide. My apologies. There's the key factors of our success. Let's see if I can go back. Previous. A little wrinkle. Partnership agreements. that came out of our SHARP 2 ecological program. MDOT has negotiated a master agreement, partnership agreement with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. This agreement has created a steering committee that meets twice a month. The steering committee works to break through bureaucratic barriers to further our partnership. The steering committee has overseen the completion of a geographic information system data sharing agreement, streamlining for Section 4F recreational property consultations, and the development of a larger initiative to locate MDOT wetland mitigation sites on MDNR properties. This is especially important in Michigan, which has so much coastline, and many MDNR properties are located on those coasts. So sorry, I mixed up my slides a little bit, but there's our key factors for success, which I already covered. And that pretty much covers the first two steps of the ecological process. If you'd like to get in touch with me, here's my contact information. Please feel free to call me anytime if you have questions about the ecological process. Next, I'd like to turn over the presentation to Craig Casper to talk about his work in Colorado.
Good afternoon. Following Margaret's presentation, I will be focusing on the next steps in the ecological approach, how we prepared a regional ecosystem framework, as well as explain the benefits it provided, along with some lessons we learned during the 3 progressively more detailed efforts that we began in 2006. That is a key lesson we learned, actually, is you can't expect to build the trust and get the data and conduct the analyses necessary for a complete and rigorous regional analysis in one 4-year planning cycle. It takes a continuous, comprehensive, and collaborative approach over successive plan efforts. In the practical tips section, the goals and summaries for the steps provide you with information on how to consider planning scenarios for evaluating natural resources and transportation to assess their impacts and prioritize actions. Additional information is also included on the FHWA Ecological webpage. Shown here is the summary of Step 3, creating an REF. For other great examples on setting up an REF, please look at both the Charlottesville MPO and the North Central Texas COG web pages that are listed under the ecological wheel. Some background on the Pikes Peak area. We are the MPO for Colorado Springs and are located in central Colorado along the Front Range. Along with being among the 4 or 5 most conservative areas of the country, we are also the highest MPO in the country with elevations between 6,000 and 14,000 feet. This creates a lot of different ecological subsets in our region. While areas as conservative as the Pikes Peak region are generally not as planning friendly as more progressive areas, in Colorado Springs we recognize that there are indirect and tertiary effects of transportation actions. Some of these are desired effects and some of these are not. Our use of ecological is an attempt to be as deliberate as possible in addressing other needs as we are addressing transportation needs. In order to be efficient and effective in accomplishing this, we have to collaborate and partner with federal, state, and local agencies. I will discuss this more later. It did not change. Key examples of our partnership are sharing data, sharing agency priorities, and sharing expertise in non-transportation related subjects. The first test of these was developing a map of existing land uses and how compatible each land use was with a different social, economic, or environmental condition. In order to measure changes from the present to the future, we had to select specific items to forecast and then evaluate for those changes. For environmental changes, we used 59 targets that were selected by both subject matter experts and local elected officials. We then forecast the location of population and job growth, along with the implementation of all kinds of different infrastructure projects to determine what the potential future conditions could be. Since the only thing we know for sure about any of our individual forecasts is that they are wrong, we created 2 additional land use development scenarios. Yeah, it's not changing for me. These land use scenarios were to bookend possible futures. This sensitivities test had the effect of bracketing extreme ends of possible development impacts and provide a spectrum of types and magnitude of impacts. Another key concept we embraced is using watersheds as our boundary for impact analysis, because this is how environmental agencies do it. This map shows the Fountain Creek and Chico Creek basins and covers an area about double the size of our MPO boundary. It also extends south into the core of the Pueblo MPO south of Colorado Springs. The white area in the middle of the screen is the city of Colorado Springs, and the darker the shading is, the higher the quality of the habitat. You can see the city of Pueblo as the white area at the bottom center of the map. Because of this extended evaluation region, we also reached out and involved the Pueblo MPO and their local officials and staff in the effort. In 2013, PPACG received a SHARP 2 grant to develop a regional mitigation plan. This 2-year project was completed in July 2015. The purpose of this project was to expand on the previous SHARP 2 studies that were completed and to develop a regional mitigation plan to address comprehensive mitigation needs for all of the infrastructure projects throughout the region as a blueprint for, and create a blueprint for mitigation in the region. The project tasks were to develop screening tables that show the risks associated with each of the proposed transportation projects, and these tables will be standardized for assessing projects into the future. In initiating this project, it was critical to think about what the future impacts would be and determine opportunities for project partnerships. For instance, in this project, we collaborated with a local watershed district to find joint opportunities for project mitigation. The district has projects in the same general area where our recommended transportation mitigation sites were best implemented. There are also other myriad of potential partner projects from nonprofits and local entities that could be partnered with. The idea we had was to group efforts for more efficient and impactful mitigation. The third concept is to conserve and connect important habitats and make sure all the linkages between them are protected. We also worked to streamline the permitting processes by informing everyone, including resource and regulatory agencies, what the impacts across the region are likely to be ahead of time from the many different agencies and projects that are coming. Finally, this project assessed potential areas of mitigation located off-site, not directly associated with any specific transportation project, or for their overall contribution to environmental agency goals, both state and federal goals. To help guide this process, a SHARP 2 advisory committee was developed. The key to SHARP 2 projects is the collaborative nature of them. I would like to say that we sent out letters to all these agencies and they jumped at the opportunity to participate in our process. However, any multi-agency collaboration process is never really that easy. Out of the 17 agencies listed here, we got consistent participation from about 10 of them. The reason for this is because they're all really busy and this is outside of their normal work stream. Local agencies were also really suspicious of somehow federalizing their local projects, and so they were somewhat reluctant to participate initially. What we ended up doing was meeting in ways and locations that each of the individual agency representatives preferred. In some cases, that meant going to their offices when they had free time and canceling our own meetings. The roles of these resource agencies were to identify potential project opportunities, to review and identify critical areas, identify potential opportunities to collaborate with existing sponsors of other projects that they knew about and we didn't, identify potential regulatory and non-regulatory hurdles and barriers. This group met formally about 8 or 9 times over the course of the 2-year project. During these meetings, we focused on keeping the meeting short and purposeful in order to respect everyone's time. If we thought there might be a contentious issue, we employed a third-party neutral facilitator, although I'm honestly not sure that that was really necessary. Next, transportation impact buffers were created around each transportation project depending on the scope of the project and its surrounding environment. This was based on prior knowledge and expertise of planners who had worked on NEPA studies in the state or region before. Some mitigation requirements were identified based on regulation or statute, and some mitigation desires were identified based on impacts to highly desirable habitats or connecting links or projects that might have potential for funding from some different sources, like nonprofits. Existing regulatory mitigation rules allow for out-of-type and out-of-area mitigation, so we use this as justification for creating an overall impact mitigation plan in place of identifying mitigation sites near each transportation project. External projects evaluated include projects from other organizations as one set. What we wanted to avoid was haphazard random acts of kindness that are spread around the region, and to replace them with a deliberate plan for mitigation that is cognizant of the environment in the 2 watersheds and of the overall impacts upon crucial habitats in the region and the state. This table lists 9 of the projects that were identified as having impacts that will require mitigation. These are transportation projects. The table shows the project ID, the name of the project, the size of the project, including a buffer around the project, and actual impacted acres. It breaks the impacts into the 3 bins that had previously been identified also. Data was compiled in order to analyze and prioritize the impacts. The last column represents the impact importance, which is based on the acres impacted versus the relative importance of the species in the area affected by the transportation project. The formula used weighs the amount of affected acreage more than the number of affected targets. Small acreage is downgraded because of the size of the physical impact. A larger impact value was placed on larger projects and also probably made the projects more expensive. The overall impacts of the preferred land use plan and the physically constrained project portfolio is shown here. This information was used to develop a green infrastructure framework of connected habitats that satisfies the adopted environmental goal from our transportation plan. Our regional goal is to improve, protect, and mitigate the impacts to critical habitats and connecting corridors that are suitable for threatened, endangered, and imperiled species. There are 5 key benefits of a regional ecological framework, and they're listed here. The one that I try to emphasize locally is that this can improve our outcomes and make the development process more predictable. A benefit that I personally appreciate the most is better collaboration and increased trust between agencies. We started to understand the why of each desired action from different agencies, and they started to understand why we desired certain projects in certain locations. Lessons we learned, and I only learned things the hard way, are to make sure that all interests are represented, because even the perception of bias is a significant issue. We used web-based conferencing to make meeting attendance easier because everybody's busy and we did not want to give anyone an excuse not to participate. We needed to define the roles of participants and the goals of the project during the kickoff meeting so that everyone knew what to expect. We also needed to learn from past mistakes. We needed to be light on our feet, adapt and improvise as we went along. We identified milestones and decision points so that people knew what their input accomplished and when their participation was actually needed. There's also finally a possible cost to data and license agreements, but these can be eliminated with good partnering. And we also used online mapping tools to disseminate information that everyone could access that was password protected. You'll know you did good if you strengthen collaborative partnerships. This building trust is useful in many ways beyond the effort that we had here. We got resource agencies to agree on regional advanced mitigation plans. In general, but we fell short of actually having a written agreement up to this point because state and federal agencies don't really see an MPO as having the oomph to have a formal agreement with. A state DOT is likely necessary to formalize an agreement with the resource agencies, and we hope to work with CDOT on our 2050 plan. The ultimate outcome that we are looking for is the development of a green infrastructure plan that codifies the impact mitigation ratios with resource and regulatory agencies, along with the types and locations of mitigation efforts, in order to create a coherent regional network of connected habitats. Thank you very much for listening. Up next, I don't have control anymore. Judy, it's on you now. Thank you.
Okay. This is Judy Gates. I'm the director of Maine DOT's Environmental Office, and we've been working on a SHARP 2 project. And the steps that I'm going to talk about in implementing ecological today are some of the closing steps about programmatic agreements and collaboration. So the focus of our SHARP 2 ecological project was Atlantic salmon, or rather on the Section 7 process associated with Atlantic salmon. Salmon have a historic range that covers about half to a third of the watersheds in Maine, which means that we intersect with them quite often. But it also means that rarely do other states have the issues that we're dealing with. So this was the focus area of our regional ecosystem framework. In addition to these, there are several other watersheds, more southern and more northern as well, where the species occurs, but federal agencies generally are at odds with the state resource agencies about how protected this habitat should be, and so it hasn't been designated as either a distinct population segment or as critical habitat. We're talking about anywhere the species has ever occurred, occurs now, or could occur in the future, which is a pretty big basket. For context, I'd let you know that there have been 2 adult salmon returns to the Androscoggin River, which is in the southern part of the green and blue area, and a handful of salmon each to the Kennebec and Penobscot rivers. These have been divided into habitat recovery units, and so we're not talking about a huge number of fish here. Okay. Oops. Next. I don't seem to be able to control it. There we go. So our focus at Maine DOT is how the salmon cross our roads through culverts or under bridges like these. When we have maintenance projects to repair or replace them, our NEPA and project schedules become delayed with Section 7 consultations. One more. There we go. So where do salmon intersect with DOT projects? Well, before we might even encounter a fish in the field, we have 9 capstone performance measures here at Maine DOT. All of the measures are listed in our work plan and in our strategic plan as well. And we've been living the most closely with on-time delivery, which translates into project schedules. The expectation is that 85% of our projects will be delivered on time, so within 30 days of the originally forecasted advertised date, and on budget, so less than 10% different from the award price. So these are the 2 that are most relevant and were most affected by consulting for salmon. About 25% of our stream projects per work plan year require consultation for Atlantic salmon. There are activities that fall into the no effect bucket that we don't need to worry about. But those 50 consultations, about 10 of those end up being formal consultations with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. There's also a split of jurisdiction in that below the tide, the head of tide, the National Marine Fisheries Service has jurisdiction, and above the head of tide, U.S. Fish and Wildlife has jurisdiction. So who makes that call is sometimes up in the air. We do have a transportation liaison in place, at least we did during this project. We now have 2. And that position completed 7 consultations in 2014, 10 in 2015. So if you have a need to complete 50, 7 and 10 are not cutting it. That made Section 7 critical path on 100% of the projects intersecting with Atlantic salmon. Our expectations varied widely. Our programs expected to be able to meet their delivery dates. We expected in our environmental office to be able to negotiate and explain why we had to build projects in a certain location or in a certain way. And the resource agencies expected us to comply with the Endangered Species Act, understandably. What we also found is that our design and construction methods do not vary very much, despite how they may be described. When it comes down to it, there's not a lot of variation in something like placing a sheet pile cofferdam. The other issue is that about 98 to 99% of our projects qualify for categorical exclusions. What this means is that we didn't want to go down the road of developing a huge process or trying to solve a problem we didn't have because we aren't doing a lot of EAs or EISs. So we wanted whatever we did to apply to the everyday projects, and those are the projects that also require consultation. So how did we apply the ecological approach? To tackle this issue, we actually looked first at a gap analysis. We looked at our own house to see what we needed to get in order We wanted to see what steps of ecological we were already applying but might not be calling ecological. For instance, looking at ecosystem status, data, and goals. We have a lot of GIS layers that give us that information, but it wasn't under the heading of ecological. And so we weren't necessarily looking at it holistically or proactively. We would screen projects when they became part of the work plan, which is after the budgets were established and the schedules were established. So that was a little late in the process. So after this gap analysis, we got our own things straight. And what we found is that projects with a check mark next to endangered species on our main CE checklist couldn't receive NEPA sign-off until Section 7 was complete. And by complete, that meant that the BO was complete. Now, our U.S. Fish and Wildlife here in Maine was requiring very specific details about projects right down to construction, placement of erosion and sedimentation control. They were really concerned about the few salmon and for instance, the nesting areas and the migration areas that we did know about. And so because of that, we often wouldn't have our BOs done until well after our preliminary design review, which would mean it was really late in the game to change anything. We were having a lot of headbutting about that and a lot of kind of scrambling to figure out the quality of the habitat and whether fish were really present, whether we could do that or U.S. Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries had to do it. So the later these things occurred, pre-construction, the more of a risk we had to schedule and budget. So we looked to steps 1, 6, 7, and 8 as removing the proverbial dam of consultations. Thank you. So once we knew the key steps to focus on, we set about our tasks, divided the work, set some timelines that we thought were pretty reasonable, and dove in. As we made progress in our work, we had to actually revise our approach, and you'll see that this slide is entitled the Plan 3.0. It could probably be 6.0. We had changes along the way. We had changes in staff in every agency. We had dramatic changes in workloads. We had northern long-eared bats. We had various levels of belief in the project and different ideas of what priority meant and on the timing of completing these tasks. As a result, this is a little bit later than we had hoped, but considering the amount of doubt that we had at different times that we could even get here, it really paid it to be flexible and be able to extend our outlook. And our appreciation goes out to Federal Highway and to the SHARP 2 program in allowing the flexibility for us to keep going on the project after it was technically supposed to be done. For more information on these steps, you can also review them in both the handbook and on links to other examples on the Federal Highway Ecological webpage. So to show you what we actually changed, this was our vision at the beginning of how we were going to go through this process. We thought we would just, make a list of who does what. We would set the schedule. People would understand, everybody in the different agencies would understand intuitively how we would all benefit, and we'd all march toward the end. We ended up having a really helpful implementation assistance process for 2 days where we sat down and realized we were pretty far apart in terms of trust and believability, credibility, and we as the DOT couldn't really understand why somebody wouldn't want our assistance in, for instance, drafting the biological assessment. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff weren't even sure we could legally do that. So that was a pretty big hurdle to get over that we realized pretty late in the process when we took the time to sit down and had somebody else lead the conversation. We had a subsequent visit from Resource Center staff that really helped, and we have since redrafted the programmatic biological assessment, and in fact have had Army Corps and U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Federal Highway help from outside the state as well as from our staff to draft not only the final programmatic biological assessment, but also the programmatic biological opinion, which we've drafted everything except the decision for that, the actual decision language. So all of the background, all of the species information, you know, that doesn't take a particular agency stamp on it. Everybody's worked really hard together, and we've been able to refocus our priorities and put one of our staff on it almost full time, which really sacrificed production in some ways. It really stressed him out. During this time, he's had 2 small children. So, you know, it's been a little crazy, but I think as soon as we smelled success at the end and we got some people involved that really believed in what this process could do for us as far as streamlining, it worked out really well. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is how our project delivery went before. It's the typical, you know, something needs to be done, you design it, you do your permitting, you deliver it. The arrows indicate kind of where we switched things around, and then one more click will bring up what it looks like after. Now, we didn't change our priorities based on salmon. Our priorities are still set based on safety, condition, and level of service, but we now do kind of a risk alternatives analysis, benefit cost, where that risk is risk to project schedule and project budget. So if we know, you know, we've sat down with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, said where are your priority habitats, similar to the bins that Craig talked about, we have tiers. If we know something's in a really high priority tier for them, we know we have to put out our Cadillac project. If something is in a tier 3 and not a tier 1 is the best habitat, then we know there's a no effect. So what this means is we've been able to move NEPA a little bit earlier before design, and then we're actually doing the design when we would have before. There's just a whole bunch of work that happens first. Next, please. Thank you. So the key factors of our success were to understand the clear metrics, and that was the gap analysis. We had to measure where things were. We needed a baseline of what those projects, what those consultations were taking. We needed to stay focused, and we needed to share a goal of the programmatic approach, make it clear how everybody was going to benefit. When we say engage our partners in a meaningful way, it means really listening, not listening just to reply, but really listening. And then dedicating staff, which is really tough because we're all tight on staff, but to dedicate that staff. Another important effort or element of this was that we had the support of our chief engineer, who understood the benefit, and that if we did not do this, we were not going to be able to deliver on infrastructure projects. So we have a dedicated liaison position. Now we have 2. Right. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Management engagement actually happened from the middle. It was at the regional level who convinced their senior people that this was a good way to spend time, and convinced the people right below them that this was a priority. Next slide, please. So under this programmatic biological opinion, 60% of those in-stream projects for the next 3 years, we now go to a 3-year work plan, so that's 150 projects that intersect with Atlantic salmon, they'll qualify to use this programmatic biological opinion. Our consultation time under this will be cut from 8 months or more, usually up to 2 years. to 15 days. This also, we included Army Corps so that if, in fact, Federal Highway is not involved, we can still use the programmatic biological opinion. We screen our candidates now 3 years prior to their inclusion in the work plan. This has created a little bit of a glitch in that you have those couple of awkward years that you're trying to catch up, but we're just telling everybody to hang on. We still have room for discussions on options, and we're generating funding through a pending in lieu fee associated with this for actually meaningful species-specific habitat restoration. That in lieu fee process is a webinar in of itself, so I won't talk about that. So this is my contact information. Feel free to give me a call or send me an email if you have more questions that we don't have time for. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Judy, and thank you also to Margaret and Craig for your wonderful presentations and highlighting how you've been using the Practitioner's Handbook and the steps that are included in it to implement ecological, and hopefully that'll be useful to those that are participating in our webinar today and those that also on-demand view the webinar after today's live event to see how they can apply it to their own presentations. We are running a little bit short on time, so I don't think we're going to have a ton of time for questions today. So if you do have a burning question, feel free to add it into the chat box. You have seen everyone's contact information throughout today's webinar, and I'll put that up one last time. So if you have a question that we don't get to today, please feel free to reach out to any of our panelists after the webinar, or you can also send questions to me, Katie Kurgan at AASHTO, and I'll make sure that we get back to you. So the slide that we have up now is a number of practitioners' handbooks that were published years ago, but through the Center for Environmental Excellence, AASHTO was able to update these 7 practitioners' handbooks. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look at them yet, they are available on the Center for Environmental Excellence webpage, and so we do recommend that you download them and take a look at them there. We also wanted to mention to you that there are a number of other practitioners' handbooks that the Center for Environmental Excellence is currently developing, and within the next month, we'll have the Complying with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act for Transportation Projects handbook published, and then early in 2017, you will also be seeing a air quality practitioner's handbook. So as I mentioned, we do have just a few minutes for questions. You are on mute, but if you have anything that you'd like to ask, you can go to your control panel on the right-hand section of your screen and type a question into the question box and just hit send. I am going to throw up our contact information so that you can jot that down if you have something for Dave Williams or I from AASHTO and Federal Highways on the SHARP 2 program or ecological overall, and we also have Margaret, Craig's, and Judy's contact information. I did get one really important question regarding whether or not these presentation slides will be made available after the webinar, and in fact they will. They'll be loaded on the Center for Environmental Excellence website in the very near future, as well as this live webinar. So if you'd like to share them with your colleagues, please point them to the Center for Environmental Excellence's webpage. So with that, I am going to conclude today's webinar. Feel free to reach out to any of us, and thank you so much for participating. And should you have any questions about SHARP 2, please feel free to reach out to myself or Dave Williams, and we hope that we can help you strive to expedite project delivery and implement ecological in your agency in the near future. Thank you.